My lady, please, can I call Dr. Chris Llewellyn?
Rwyf yn datgan yn ddiffiant ac yn wir ac yn cadarnhau y bydd y dystiolaeth aroddaf, y gwir, yr holl wir, a'r gwir yn unig.
To the best of my knowledge.
Could you commence, please, by giving your full name?
Chris Llewellyn.
Dr. Llewellyn, thank you for your attendance and for assisting the inquiry. As you give evidence, could you please remember to keep your voice up, and we'll take it slowly as we have stenographers taking a note for the transcript. You have kindly provided 2 witness statements for this module. The first is INQ 3027371, dated the 6th of September 2023. The second is INQ 3041090, dated the 2nd of February 2024. And you have signed both of those statements, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And can you please confirm that the contents of those statements are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yeah, that's true.
And it's right to say you also provided both written and oral evidence to Module 1 of this inquiry.
Yeah, I did.
And we're very grateful for your continued assistance.
Thank you.
By way of your professional background and involvement with the Welsh Local Government Association, or the WLGA, if you're content that we refer to it as that, in 2002, you joined the WLGA as Director of Lifelong Learning, Leisure and Information. You then became the Deputy Chief Executive in 2010, and you have been the Chief Executive since January 2019. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
In terms of the operation of the WLGA then, it was established in 1996, is that correct? Membership is voluntary, but in Wales, all 22 local authorities are members, along with all 3 fire and rescue authorities, and the 3 national parks authorities are associate members.
Yeah.
You explain in your statement that the WLGA works to give local government a strong and credible voice within national government. It's a cross-party organisation and seeks to operate on the basis of consensus, where leaders and senior members from different political groups are involved in the business of the WLGA and in representing the collective voice of local government.
Yeah.
Can I then begin by asking you about the period of January to March 2020? But before we go into particular detail, could you please give a broad overview of the general role played by the WLGA over the pandemic in Wales?
Yeah, as you mentioned, the WLGA represents the 22 unitary authorities in Wales. The national parks and the fire authorities are associate members as well. And what we endeavour to do in all the work that we do is to give local government an effective voice, act as an interface between the 22 local authorities and all tiers of government, primarily the Welsh Government, but the UK Government as well. We take the view that we deliver the best outcomes for the people of Wales if all tiers of government work as closely together as possible. And we also believe that decisions about how services are run and provided locally, that decisions about those services need to be made as close to the point of delivery as possible. So throughout the COVID period, our work was informed by that approach, that we were located in the most appropriate position to act as that interface between the 22 local authorities and the Welsh Government, but other tiers of government and other national partners as well. And in a sense, wherever and whenever we felt that there was a need or there was an opportunity to provide that local voice, then we tried as effectively as we could to provide that during the course of the COVID crisis.
Just generally thinking then about the role that was played, was the role as you envisaged it might be in a crisis such as this, or was it something different?
No, I think it was very different from what we'd anticipated. The reality is no one had been through an experience like this before. Although we engaged in some aspects of civil contingencies preparation, I don't think we'd envisaged a crisis as deep or as long as this. And in a sense, we were developing processes and procedures as the crisis progressed.
Can we then begin to look at some specific dates? Yeah. And you provide a chronology in your witness statement, which we don't need to go to. But on that list, there is a record of a meeting on the 12th of March 2020, and the event is described as Covid-19 local government meeting, brackets, First Minister, Minister for Health and several leaders. Was that the first meeting where Covid-19 was formally discussed between the Welsh Government and the WLGA?
It would have been the first meeting where there were discussions at a political level. One of the things we emphasise as an association is the primacy of politics, that it's important that elected members speak to elected members. And in this instance, it was a case of Welsh Government ministers and the First Minister speaking for the first time to our elected leaders.
Is the date of the 12th of March, thinking back, quite late?
Yeah, I think it is. There had been some internal discussions within the WLGA prior to that. We had a briefing from Public Health Wales on the 28th of February. I think it's fair to say that at the time, leaders were underwhelmed. If it may be fair to say there was a sense of disquiet and maybe an expectation that there would be a greater sense of urgency.
That comes on to my next question. In terms of that meeting itself, what is your recollection of the mood?
Of the meeting on the 12th?
On the 12th of March.
Of being very profound, serious and almost sombre meeting.
Can I then please bring up a document which is the minutes of a Chief Executive's teleconference on the 20th of March 2020, INQ 408984. And on page 1, we can see the title, Education. And we see there, WG definition of key workers published this afternoon. No discussion with WLGA beforehand. WLGA been advising LAs to follow UK government guidance initially, as this is what the public will expect. Is that a specific instance that caused a problem or a concern that you can recall?
I think it caused a concern, and I suppose it highlights a theme which was to develop throughout the crisis, because, as I mentioned earlier, on the one hand, the association tries to create a consensus wherever possible, and we try to get different tiers of government to work as effectively together as possible. So there was a sense that consistent messaging, even at this early stage, from all tiers of government was important. But at the same time, there was a need for local operational delivery understanding to inform strategic thinking and strategic policy. So I think that's the concern there, that the lack of discussion beforehand.
Staying on this document then, if we can go to page 2, please, and it's the middle of the page, and it's concerns about the shielding scheme. And we can see there, it says potentially huge numbers locally. LAs have not seen or had input into the letter. Concerns around number of residents will require support from the council. And so before we go into this, to what extent were local authorities expected to be responsible for people who were shielding in terms of delivering services?
At this time, I don't think it was entirely clear. I think the principle was understood, but there'd been very little discussion about the detail, and I think hence there was an assumption of what the local authority role would be, but there was certainly concern about every aspect of it, I think.
And is that something that was clarified?
It would have been clarified as things progressed. If you were to go back to the first page of the account of the meeting and the education section, where it refers to but the WLGA messages to Welsh Government are to allow local authorities to implement whatever plans can be put in place. And in a sense, what we were saying was, in this instance, in order to get actions delivered as effectively as possible, that sometimes it would be easier to describe rather than prescribe, to describe what authorities were able to deliver in the timescales available, rather than be prescriptive in advance and then struggle to meet the prescription.
And is your evidence that it was the latter that the Welsh Government were trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And can we finally move to page 3 of this document? And we can see the last bullet point here provides almost a summary of this meeting. Concerns about Welsh Government's emergency planning approach and coordination, lack of engagement with LAs, poor communication, delay in approaches following UK Government announcements, Welsh Government 48 hours behind the curve. Welsh Government key workers list came out 12 hours after UK Government on afternoon of last day of school. LA's best place to respond locally and via LRFs. LA's not waiting for Welsh Government guidance or direction, planning and implementing already. WLGA already raising concerns with DGs following leaders' meeting. Now, the reference to DG, is that Director Generals?
Yeah.
If we can then move on to INQ 4089875, please. And on the 21st of March 2022, you sent an email to the Permanent Secretary of Wales and the Director Generals, and I'd like to go through this email in some detail with you, please. Now, firstly, the matters that we've just discussed, are those the types of things that prompted you to write this email?
There would have been, yeah.
And if we can look at your email on page 2, please, the first bullet point. As the crisis escalates, leaders and chief executives are concerned that collectively we need to communicate more effectively, more efficiently, and with greater precision. And are you able then to please explain why you are seeking more effective, more efficient, and greater precision in terms of communications?
Because we felt collectively that it was absent. We understood the strategic aim, if you like, in many instances, but it was the operational detail that needed to be clarified from a local authority perspective.
If we can then look at your second bullet point, please.
So it was the communication between the Welsh Government and you. It wasn't communication with the public, it was communication.
Oh, yeah, yes, definitely, yes, sorry, yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, my lady. The second bullet point then, it is also felt that earlier engagement with councils and greater trust between senior officials would speed up responses, lead to better delivery, and potentially head off some of the difficulty encountered in recent days. So breaking that point down, firstly, you make reference to desiring earlier engagement. And in the third bullet point of this email, you say, I don't believe that is happening at the moment. So there was a criticism that things were just happening too slowly at this point. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Looking back now, when do you think engagement should properly have ramped up with local government?
Do you mean a specific date or
A time? Was there a turning point for you, perhaps?
I think, if I can turn it another way, I think the engagement should have taken place as early as possible, as soon as there was a strategic direction was taken or assumed, then local authorities should have been engaged. So if it was the issue of school closure, then local authorities should have been engaged immediately in terms of how to deliver school closures and the hubs and the provision for free school meals for vulnerable learners, for key workers and so on. Local government delivers over 700 services 24 hours every day. Everybody in this room today has been using local government services. Whatever the circumstances, authorities understand how to deliver services, and that understanding can inform policy making. And the sooner I think authorities would have been involved in this instance, then that would have saved time and would have resulted in more effective policy making.
Can I just interrupt? I'm sorry, Ms. Patrick. You said they should have been engaged as soon as the strategic, one of those words I can't say, direction had been taken. But arguably, shouldn't they have been involved before?
Well, no, you're both. I agree, my lady.
Because you're the ones who are going to have to deliver it.
I agree, my lady. I think we should have been part of the strategic decision making, and in effect that the experience of delivering services should have informed the strategic thinking and decision making.
I just want to ask you about a specific comment that you make, which is about having greater trust between senior officials. Did you feel that there wasn't trust?
Well, at the time, I think that the handling of a crisis like this depends on trust and confidence, and that all tiers of government at a time of crisis should show trust and confidence in each other. And I think there was a feeling within local government that wasn't evident at all times in this instance.
And so was there a feeling that perhaps local government was being kept in the dark about conversations?
I think there's a feeling that information could have been shared more fully earlier, that available data, scenario planning, and other aspects that informed thinking and strategic policy should have been shared with local authorities.
Can we then please move on to the response that you received to this from Tracy Burke, the Director General for Education and Public Services? And her response, and I'm looking at the last part of her response. I do hope, though, that you have found our engagement with the WLGA over the weekend addresses some of your concerns. I know Steve Davies has been engaging with you on a number of issues over the weekend, and that WLGA have been actively engaged in the work on shielded people, where we have kept in close contact with WLGA in the development of the letter and guidance that accompanies it. I know how closely and at pace you have been working with WCVA2. I think Reg too has been in touch today on other urgent developments over the weekend. And Reg, presumably is Reg Kilpatrick, is that right?
Yeah.
Did things improve, as this email suggests, from your perspective?
I don't actually recall the conversations on the weekend in question here, although I don't doubt that they happened, because we were in regular, constant contact with Welsh Government colleagues through different channels. I think the point we're trying to make is that the difference, I suppose, between consultation and engaging and information sharing. And what I'm trying to say here is that local government needs to be engaged at a point when it's possible to influence and shape policy rather than being informed when policy has been agreed and is being implemented, and that local government is then being informed or engaged with in terms of delivery rather than the co-construction and the co-production of the policy.
The inquiry heard evidence earlier this week from Shan Morgan, and she was asked, were structures and processes put in place to ensure early and effective engagement with local government? Now, we know at this point she was the Permanent Secretary to the Welsh Government. Her reply in respect of her own engagement was that I would say honestly that I could have done more. I think it would probably have been a very good idea had I invited the Chief Exec of the WLGA to become a member of ex-COVID, or at least come from time to time when there was an area of particular interest. I think I could have done more to establish that level of regular contact, and in retrospect, I think I should have established myself a pattern of regular one-to-ones with both the CEO of WLGA and of Solace. Would you have any comments upon that reflection?
I agree with that. I saw I listened to Sean Morgan making the comments earlier in the week, and I agree. I think that had she done that at the time, it would have been very useful, and it probably would have addressed some of the concerns that I expressed in the email. To be honest, I did feel reassured as well, because it reflects a sense of learning, and in terms of this process, my lady, I think that the recognition on her part that in hindsight she should have done things differently means maybe that is something that can be taken on board for future reference.
Can I then please move on to discuss any role played by the WLGA in the non-pharmaceutical interventions that were imposed in Wales? And in your statement, you talk about the early stages of the pandemic, and you say consultative fora or structures had not been established. Consultation was ad hoc via emails, telephone conversations, or urgently convened meetings. There was often limited opportunity or time to provide full views or canvass wider views during the earlier stages of the pandemic. Specifically, when you refer to ad hoc emails or telephone calls, can you remember who was calling, who was writing emails, who was asking for your views?
It would have been some of the people that have already been mentioned: Reg Kilpatrick, Steve Davis. We, as an association, we have a very broad interface with the Welsh Government. So there would have been, as an association, we try and encourage as much dialogue as possible between elected members. We're a member-led organisation. I would have anticipated that there would have been informal calls between leaders and Welsh Government ministers. There would have been calls, emailed between myself and other senior officials within the Welsh Government, but also at a service level as well, within education, within social services, in transport, economy, finance as well. So there would have been a very broad interface. We also engaged with the special advisors as well.
If we can then look at some of the established structures that began to develop, and the first is that the inquiry understands the WLGA leader was invited to attend the Welsh Government's core Covid-19 group. Was that a standing invitation each week?
I don't think it was a standing invitation, but I think it happened on a regular basis.
And the inquiry also understands that the WLGA itself convened regular leaders' meetings. And on the 20th of March, the Minister for Housing and Local Government attended. The 27th of March, the Minister for Health and Social Services also attended. And you say that from the 1st of April, Welsh ministers began to regularly attend. Is that right?
Yes, as an association, we took a conscious effort that we would do everything that we could to improve the engagement between local government and the Welsh Government, and as I mentioned earlier, to act as the interface. And I think it's fair to say that ministers were very receptive to this approach. At that time, we were convening meetings of local authority leaders on an almost daily basis as the technology changed from teleconferencing to Teams and Zoom. The quality of those meetings improved. But at a very early stage, we started inviting ministers to attend those meetings as well. They were very receptive. And again, it goes back to one of the principles that I mentioned earlier, that we thought at a time of crisis it was important to be politically led and to get elected members, politicians, ministers and leaders speaking directly and freely to each other without going through the filter of officers and public bureaucracy.
To what extent were those meetings that we've just discussed used to talk about non-pharmaceutical interventions and to seek the WLGA's views?
Well, they would have been opportunities, or they would have been used for that purpose. But what would also have happened is that the leaders themselves would have used the opportunity to raise their concerns. All 22 leaders represent individual wards. They're rooted in their communities. They live in their communities and represent. They reflect the views of the people they serve. So I've no doubt that they would have been putting those concerns to ministers at those meetings.
Just before you go on, I've said there's a slight confusion on the transcript as well as in my notes, Dr. Llewellyn. So can I just correct something that you said at just so strong if I can find their own place, 1411. And I wrote down, and it may have been we misheard, that I wrote down two things that seem to be contradictory. That ministers were keen to engage, but then you said, according to my note, when you issued invitations to attend the meetings, they were not very receptive. So basically, have we missed a not, or have we included a not when we shouldn't have done?
You've included a not. Ministers were very receptive, and I recall were always ready to join those meetings if invited.
Right. Thank you. Glad we cleared that up.
Thank you, my lady. It's right that those meetings became regularised to align with the 21-day review process. Was that something that was beneficial to align with that process?
It wasn't the intention, and I think the meetings took place more regularly than the 21-day review process. There were meetings which aligned to the 21-day review process, which were useful. But our meetings, I think, took place more frequently and were more focused on particular issues.
Can we please look at the WLGA's submission to the Permanent Secretary's COVID stocktake in October 2020? INQ 40898872. This is written by Daniel Herford of the WLGA, but hopefully you might be able to speak to it as well. And if we can look at the second paragraph, the approach to engagement from officials has evolved throughout COVID-19. Inevitably, the pace and urgency of the response phase was challenging for the Welsh Government and all in public services, and this continued into the 3-weekly review of the initial lockdown. The open and effective political dialogue has not always been replicated at an official level. Despite several examples of excellent co-construction of timetabling and guidance between officials, co-production and information sharing has been inconsistent. It proved very challenging for local authorities to plan for the operational implementation of announcements, particularly those affecting council services, with limited notice during the 21-day review period. There has been significant improvement in recent months in terms of dialogue and planning for local lockdowns, but some instances where clarity and information should have been quicker. And we will come on to a number of those issues. But generally speaking, do you think there was a missed opportunity by the Welsh Government to use those meetings to talk about MPIs in more detail with local government?
I think that the email there is saying that the dialogue at a political level was very effective and very open, but that when it came to the more operational detail and a delivery focus, that discussions with officials were less open and inclusive, and that the progress that was made at a political level wasn't always reflected. It varied according to service area. In some service areas, the communication was very close and very effective. In others, it wasn't, that there wasn't a consistency. At the headline level, as it were, I think generally there was considerable consensus. On reflection, I can remember at the time speaking to other parts of the other local government organisations in other parts of the United Kingdom. They were envious of the political engagement that took place within Wales and felt that there was a better dialogue within Wales, and that local authority leaders had better access to ministers in Wales and in other parts of the country.
You say in your statement that in general the WLGA and the local authorities were supportive of the Welsh Government's approach and the MPIs. So would the problem in your view be that they could have just been brought in sooner into the discussion, perhaps about implementation that they were expected to undertake?
I think they should have been brought into this discussion about implementation much earlier. The truth is that there were a range of views within local government as well. One of the things we argue as an association is that strategy should be set nationally by central government, but then local authorities should interpret that and deliver according to local circumstances. Where local circumstances differed, there would have been different views, but also a recognition that a single national coherent message in these circumstances was important as well. So I think that that's reflected in the discussion of the October fire break.
Just about to move onto the fire break, and it's right that there were some differences of opinion between local authorities, and in fact Councillor Andrew Morgan was asked to collate and coordinate local authority views. We don't need to bring it up, but the document is INQ 40898664. And was that something the Welsh Government asked to be produced for them?
I think we were asked to reflect the local government view, and it's something we would have routinely done. We would have consulted on 22 to get a sense of what their view was. As has been mentioned already, we've always taken the view that if local government speaks as one with one voice, then it's more powerful than having a disparate set of voices. So in this instance, in terms of the fire break, there were differing views. A range of factors would have been taken into account. There would have been differences between East and West and between urban and rural authorities, but we did come to a consensus view. I think the collective view was it was more important to get a unanimous view and a single message than to have differing responses in each authority.
And we don't need to display it again, but returning to the WLGA's submission to the COVID stock take, it's noted that the level of dialogue, in particular around the fire break in the past week, where ministers engaged with leaders and chief executives through several meetings to help inform and prepare for decisions affecting their areas or services has been a model of central-local relations. Is that fair?
Yeah, the point we're making there is that in that instance, it was a consultation at a point when there was a chance of influencing the decision.
In terms of existing structures that were in place going into the pandemic, to what extent were existing partnership structures used, and did local authorities find those forums to be helpful?
Are you referring to the Partnership Council and
Yes.
the arrangements that sit underneath that?
Yes, please.
They were the Partnership Council is something that exists under the Government of Wales Act, and it defines the relationship between local government and central government in Wales. It is unique to Wales, and there are a range of subcommittees that sit underneath the Partnership Council. The finance subgroup through which the local government finance settlement is negotiated is one of those. During COVID, when the Partnership Council met, all 22 leaders attended, along with a range of a range of Welsh government ministers. Those arrangements worked effectively. But other arrangements were put in place as well to facilitate the dialogue between ministers and leaders, because certainly on the local government side, it was felt that more regular dialogue was needed.
Now, it's right that you submitted a second witness statement to this inquiry, and I just want to ask you about a comment you make in general about the lessons learned exercises undertaken. And you say it would be easy for the inquiry to get the wrong impression about these exercises. And you say the problem is that this does not fully reflect the WLGA's view of what happened. Indeed, these Welsh Government reviews have in substance, if not exclusively, been undertaken within Welsh Government itself and have not involved key partners, including local government. And my question is whether, in your view, there is a better way to conduct lessons learned on behalf of central government.
Yes, I think there is. I think that a wider range of partners, a wider range of views should contribute to the learning lessons review. I think there are some things that we've discussed today which recognise that things could be improved. And I think we would have both liked and expected to have been more involved in that work than we have been.
Can I change topic then and move on to the legislation and regulations and the role played by local authorities? And in respect of this in your statement, you say consultation and engagement between Welsh Government officials and local government professionals was inconsistent on consultation on finalised drafts, was often late, rather than co-produced from an earlier point. Now, was this a problem throughout the course of the pandemic, or can you pinpoint a specific time period?
I think it was a problem throughout, and as I've tried to explain, I think it varied according to service area, and it improved during the course of the pandemic. But the underlying principle was a source of ongoing concern for us.
Can we perhaps pinpoint a specific date? On the 5th of August 2020, there was an enforcement meeting with the First Minister, and this was in the context of businesses such as cafes, restaurants and clubs reopening outdoors and planned to open indoors. The inquiry understands the First Minister asked for confirmation as to whether existing legislative powers would permit local authorities to act if issues were identified with premises not complying with the regulations. And if we can have on screen, please, INQ 3022841, which was a briefing note for that meeting. Do you recognise this document?
Yeah.
Do you know who produced it?
I can't recall.
Was it on the part of the WLGA?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I think it was, yes.
And if we can please look at the bottom of page 2 into page 3. And it says, it cannot be overemphasised that our officers have a depth and breadth of experience and knowledge, and we willingly offer this in the spirit of co-production. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, this resource has been overlooked in the planning, preparation and drafting of legislation. As a result, significant public protection resource across Wales has been ploughed into deciphering and interpreting regulations instead of being put to better use on the front line of providing advice and guidance to businesses and the public. Does this then suggest that even the finalised regulations that were published were not always easy to understand?
Yes, it does. This is, I think the note is relatively clear. This is a complex area. There was experience and capacity within local government. Had it been used at an earlier point, then it would have led to better regulations and better guidance, and would have probably saved time.
The inquiry understands from your statement that an officer was actually seconded to the Welsh Government in May 2020 to provide an operational and enforcement perspective. Is that something that proved to be beneficial?
It did. It's the scale and capacity. I think more of those kinds of secondments would have been very useful, I think.
Like to then move on, please, to local lockdowns and restrictions. Generally speaking, to what extent were local authorities and the WLGA consulted by the Welsh Government in respect of decisions to impose local restrictions?
Are you talking about any specific time period?
Yes, this would be just before heading into the fire break around the August-September period, when we started to see restrictions in Caerphilly.
All right, yeah. I think as the year progressed, then the engagement, improved engagement with between elected members improved, and one of our concerns within the WLGA and within local government was the way, I think I mentioned earlier, the data was shared with us, and the available evidence and the most up-to-date evidence was shared. And as local lockdowns and other arrangements, the October fire break were discussed, increasingly relevant evidence was shared with local authorities as well, so that leaders could be part of an informed decision-making process.
Not going to go to the document in the interest of time, but there was a lessons learned document created about experiences of local lockdowns, and that's INQ 4089884. And one point made is that clarity and consistency is needed around the implementation of local lockdowns and restrictions. It says process, summary and clarity of who takes what decision when, what is or should be the role of leaders in process. Were those issues that were addressed by the Welsh Government, and did they improve?
They certainly improved. I'd have to look in more detail at the extent to which they were fully addressed. My sense is that they weren't. But again, I think they're issues, and I think that paper, it talks about, I think it goes on to talk about contact tracing as well. And I'd expect that review to have fed into any learning lessons exercise.
I think we just briefly touched upon mention of data, and staying with this document, under the heading data, it says there has been an issue around the consistency and sharing of data. Chief executives and leaders have not had consistent access to the most recent 7-day figures on cases and testing used by Welsh Government, and until reported in the media, several were not aware their authority areas were in the amber category. What kinds of problems did that cause?
There would have been a range of problems. It's a point that I think I highlighted. It was a concern from the outset that it's the trust and confidence issue of information being shared as early and in as timely way as possible. And that information would have had an impact on all the services provided by local authorities and the considerations and the decisions that they would have made and the way they would have fed into discussions with the Welsh Government as well.
Can we then discuss, please, the care sector? And this will be explored in more detail in a later module. But in terms of delivery of care in Wales, what is the responsibility of local authorities in respect of care?
Well, they're set out in the Social Services and Wellbeing Act, and the local authorities have responsibility for those people who need care and who need support, also responsibilities for the people who provide care and support for them, as well as in addition, there's a wider responsibility for the delivery of social services as well, and there's a safeguarding responsibility for children, young people and adults.
If we can go back to where we began in March 2020, please. It's right that the WLGA issued a joint statement with ADSS Cymru. And whilst these will be matters for later modules, can we have that statement, please? INQ 4082951. And the statement says, social care staff are undertaking a critical role at this time. Like others in the health and care sector, they are keeping people and children and young people safe, providing a range of care and support to others. I would like to thank them for the work that they have done and will be doing. We need to ensure that they are safe and well enough to work, which means they need to be able to protect themselves with personal protective equipment as appropriate. We are calling for an extension of the testing regime as soon as possible to include social care staff so that people who are well enough to work can do so. Can you outline, please, what led to this?
I think there was a general sense that the needs of social care staff as a whole weren't being taken into account, that you've already heard in some of the evidence sessions this week about testing arrangements and the provision of PPE. I think there was a sense within the workforce that they were being neglected and weren't taken into consideration and account in the same way as other service areas. And I think it was a feeling both within the workforce but within wider local government as well, that they weren't appreciated as fully as they should have done, that there was an issue of parity of esteem with other health workers. I think everybody knows the rewards in this sector are very modest, and throughout the pandemic, I think the social care workforce performed valiantly, brilliantly, incredibly well, above and beyond anything that could have been expected of them. And for a brief period, there was a sense that they were appreciated in the same way as their colleagues within the NHS. But there was also the underlying feeling that their needs, both in terms of testing and PPE in particular, weren't considered in the same way as other service areas.
Thank you. I don't have any further questions for you. My lady, I understand there are some rule 10s, and can I apologise for my mispronunciation earlier? Thank you.
Thank you. 7.
Good
afternoon, Mr Llewellyn.
Afternoon.
I represent the Covid-19 bereaved families of Justice Cymru. Just a very short question from paragraph 53 of your witness statement. If we can bring it up just to assist you, but I will read it to you as well. It's INQ 3041095, so it's paragraph 53. Okay. Here you state that, in the view of the Welsh Local Government Association, the key lesson learnt should be that we need collective and inclusive planning led by Welsh Government with a whole systems approach, engaging all partners who have a role to play. Local government is concerned that this learning is being lost and that we might revert to the situation of inadequate planning and readiness for the next national emergency of the future, which was explored in Module 1. So my first question is this: how do you envisage the whole system approach looking?
Can you bear with me a moment? It's only just appeared on,
Okay,
on the
yes,
screen.
Paragraph 53.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay. In our evidence submission to Module 1 and in the supplementary evidence submission to Module 2B, I think we list a number of recommendations as far as going forward and learning lessons. So I'd stand by all of those recommendations. It's a particular problem within emergency planning, the idea of inherited memory, institutional memory, and as there are staff changes, officers move on, it's lost. So it's more important than in many service areas to record that institutional memory, as it were. As I've mentioned earlier, I would have expected any reflective process of looking at the lessons that were learned from the COVID period to include as many partners as possible. I certainly think that that local government should have been included, but other sectors as well, the voluntary sector, and all those who were part of the response phase, I'd expect them to be included in the process as well.
Okay, next question then, please. Do you consider there is an appetite within the Welsh Government to implement the whole system approach you describe? And if not, what do you consider to be the resistance?
It isn't evident that that appetite is there at the moment. I can't really comment on where the resistance is. We have, since the pandemic, we have written to ministers, expressed concern about the capacity within some of the enforcement services, within environmental health and within trading standards, also within emergency planning as well. I think it's worth bearing in mind that at the start of the pandemic, local government had gone through 10 years of austerity. According to your ONS figures, the workforce had been cut by 37,000 staff. The budget had been cut in real terms by about £900,000. Inevitably, that has an impact on capacity. Some of those areas that were cut were environmental health, trading standards, and would have been emergency planning. I think the COVID experience points in the direction of not making similar cuts in those areas going forward. So I'd expect that to be part of the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are my questions. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Ms. Ms. Fubister.
Good afternoon, Mr. Llewellyn. I represent John's campaign in Care Rights UK. You say in your witness statement, and I don't think we need to put it up, at paragraph 24, that local authorities were uniquely well placed to be the first port of call for the most vulnerable people. Why do you say that?
For a variety of reasons. Chief among them is the fact that elected members, councillors, live within the communities that they represent. They have a personal relationship with their ward members. They have a face-to-face relationship in the way that other tiers of government don't always have. Similarly, officers throughout local government invariably live within their authorities as well and have a close understanding and relationship with the communities and the individuals they represent.
And do you think that during the pandemic, local authorities were able to adequately support the most vulnerable people, including people in care?
I think they did their best. We've discussed the responsibilities of local authorities within the context of the Social Services and Wellbeing Act. The Coronavirus Act provided some easements in terms of how authorities discharge those responsibilities. To my knowledge, those easements were very rarely, if ever, used. Authorities had to do things in a different way because of the circumstances, utilising remote working. I'm also conscious that there was a great emphasis on using unpaid carers, of using friends and relatives, but in many instances, because that was the option that was chosen or was deemed to be more appropriate. So I think authorities faced the challenge of doing things differently. They also had the challenge of the impact of COVID on their own workforces. Some of them were shielded, many of them were vulnerable as well. But I think they discharged their responsibilities, and that they did do things differently.
You also refer in your witness statement to concerns raised by the WLGA about care home discharges. What concerns were raised?
It was specifically the issue of testing before people were discharged from hospital to care homes. And I am conscious today that there may be people here who suffered bereavement as a consequence, and I do express my deepest sympathies. And it was something that was discussed on a regular basis in our meetings with ministers. It was raised as a deeply personal concern on the part of leaders. Many of them spoke passionately about people within their community, friends and families who'd suffered as a consequence of the policy. Even, I think, the day before the Welsh Government changed the policy, the matter was raised by some of our leaders with ministers.
And do you recall when the concerns were first being raised by the WLGA?
I could, I don't remember, but it will have been recorded in our documents, and I think it would have been in one of the early meetings. As soon as leaders would have been alert to the anxiety, then they would have raised it.
And you say that the concerns were raised with ministers. What was the response?
I think that my recollection, again, this will be recorded in the documentation, my immediate recollection is that the Welsh Government and ministers were following scientific advice.
Thank you. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you very much. Dr. Llewellyn, it's almost like deja vu. In Module 1, planning and preparedness, I heard a fair bit about how local authorities weren't sufficiently involved in the planning. And given the whole concept of the civil contingency system is to have local authorities and others whom you also represent as first responders and the like, I just find it extraordinary that it seems to be a common theme around the UK. This isn't just Wales, that local authorities aren't sufficiently involved in something that they're going to have to deliver if the worst hits us.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah, have I got it right?
Well, yeah, no, I agree. I agree with your comments. I think it didn't crop up in the discussion, but I think the Civil Contingencies Act is outdated and is no longer fit for purpose and needs to be reviewed urgently. If you look at the history of emergency planning going back to the Second World War, the days of Dad's Army, the Civil Defence Act in 1948, they respond to the challenges at the time. It was during the Second World War, was the threat of invasion. After 1948, it was the threat of nuclear attack and the Cold War, when the Civil Contingencies Act came in, it was because there was a perception that we would have major incidents, one-off events, floods, airline crashes, train crashes, and so on. At the time, nobody envisaged a global pandemic of the nature and the scale of the COVID crisis. I think we need to look at it again. I don't think it's fit for purpose. It isn't appropriate for a crisis of the duration of COVID. And significantly as well, it doesn't give elected members at any level enough of an involvement in the process as an organisation which, as I mentioned earlier, promotes the primacy of politics, of elected members taking decisions and being held to account. The Civil Contingencies Act and those arrangements that sit underneath don't take that into account.
Thank you very much indeed. I think I might have stirred some passion there towards the end. Thank you very much for your help. I know it's the second time we've opposed. I'm not sure whether we'll ask you again, but anyway, thank you for all your help so far.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pacey.
My lady, please can I call Reg Kilpatrick?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
but
truth.
the truth.
Please sit down.
Thank you.
Can you start by giving your full name, please?
My name is Reginald Thomas Kilpatrick.
Thank you very much for attending today. You have been good enough to provide 3 witness statements to this module. If we can identify those, please. One on behalf of the Local Government Directorate, dated the 3rd of October 2023, INQ 302925585. A statement dealing with enforcement of the coronavirus regulations, dated 1st of December 2023, INQ 30362241. And finally, a statement provided in your personal capacity, dated 14th of December 2023, INQ 30274156. And you have signed all 3 statements with statements of truth, is that right?
That's correct.
And can you please confirm that their contents are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
The contents are true to the best of my knowledge.
And you also provided written evidence and gave evidence in Module 1 of this inquiry. And it's fair to say you continue to assist the inquiry with its investigations, and we'd like to pass on our thanks. In terms of your career and professional background, you've worked in the Welsh Government since 1989 in a range of financial and policy roles. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In 2003, you moved into senior civil service as Deputy Director for the Budget, Planning and Management Division of the Welsh Government. You were then appointed Deputy Director of Local Government Policy Division of the Local Government Directorate in 2007.
Correct.
And then in 2011, you became Director of the Local Government Directorate. In 2013, you became additionally responsible for the Welsh Government Civil Contingencies and Emergency Planning Function, Community Safety Policy and the Welsh Fire Service.
Correct.
And in January 2020, so the start of the period that this module is looking at, is it right that the Local Government Directorate sat within the Education and Public Services Group?
It is.
In September 2020, you then became Director General for COVID Crisis Coordination and Director of the Local Government Directorate. And then in February 2022, there was a restructure of the directorates, and the remit of the Local Government Directorate was transferred to a new group called the Covid Recovery and Local Government Group.
Correct.
And you were appointed as the Director General of that group. Is that right?
That's all correct.
So during the period with which this module is concerned, January 2020 to May 2022, you had direct responsibility for the Local Government Directorate. Is that fair?
Yes.
Can we then look at Cabinet responsibility, please, for local government policy matters? From January 2020 to May 2021, that responsibility lay mainly with Julie James as Minister for Housing and Local Government.
It did.
Then from May 2021 to the end of the period that this module is concerned with, Cabinet responsibility for local government policy matters lay with Rebecca Evans as Minister for Finance and Local Government. Is that right?
It did.
Having dealt with the background and the various dates, could you please briefly explain the main function of the Local Government Directorate?
The main function of the Local Government Directorate, I think, can be summarised in three things, really. One of which is regarding the Academy Wales Leadership College for the Public Service, so that sits in Local Government Directorate. The second part would be the Community Safety Division, which looks after the operational day-to-day administration of justice and principally our relationship with the police and our oversight of the devolved fire service. The element that looks after local government relates to probably four things, one of which is making sure that we have a fair and functioning local taxation system, which provides about £3 billion income for the 22 local authorities. That we have a council tax system, which enables councils to raise money directly from individual households, which brings in about another £1.4 billion of income. And finally, sorry, I think that's probably, that's the first one. The second, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The second point is around democracy and creating the statutory conditions for local authorities to function effectively. That is in terms of making sure their democratic oversight is properly based in legislation and overseen, that the standards and conduct of individual members is put in a framework which enables them to understand what their roles are and how they should behave in conducting those roles. And thirdly, how do we increase and improve the diversity of our elected members? The third element is around local government funding. So it is my team that allocates the near £5 billion to the 22 local authorities through a formula, a very complex formula, which takes the quantum. We don't unfortunately set that quantum in my team, that's given to us, but that will then allocate those funds in a way that we believe is equal. It is done in collaboration with the 22 local authorities and provides everyone with a fair and open settlement. The fourth division relates to performance and partnership. So you'll see from my statement we are very committed to working in partnership with local government, and we support the Statutory Partnership Council and a number of other partnerships. We also look after the performance. So how do we implement some of the provisions of the 2021 Local Government Act, which sets out the statutory performance regime for the 22 local authorities?
Thank you very much. Now, as you have just confirmed, from 2013, you were responsible for Welsh Government civil contingencies and emergency planning function as an additional responsibility. Can you please assist with the function of the civil contingencies group generally?
Yeah, the civil contingencies, as it was in 2013 and beyond, was the resilient team. And it was that team that led on the policy and implementation and operationalisation of our civil contingencies functions. So it provided leadership essentially to the Category 1 and Category 2 responders who are defined, as you know, under the Civil Contingencies Act. And to the extent that we needed to mobilise, which we did on a number of occasions, the Welsh Government and the resilience team in particular, under my directorship, would provide the coordination and communication around that response.
We'll come back on to that group shortly. But in your witness statement at paragraph 24, we don't need that on screen, in terms of COVID itself, you say it's difficult to be precise as to the date on which I first learned about COVID in my professional capacity. Now, given your responsibility for civil contingencies, is it unusual that you can't pinpoint a date?
No, I wouldn't say it was. There are two types of civil contingencies that we deal with, one of which is a rapidly emerging event, for example, a marauding terrorist firearm incident, and that will be very clear, it will move very quickly. With COVID, I think the circumstances were slightly different in that we were, during January and late December, I think most of us were watching the developments in China with great interest and an increasing trepidation. And so, while I can't pinpoint the exact day at which I learned in my professional capacity, I can pinpoint the exact day when I believed it was time that the Welsh Government Civil Contingencies function needed to take some action.
If we can have on screen, please, a statement made by Vaughan Gething, Minister for Health and Social Services, on the 24th of January 2020. And this says Welsh Government is closely monitoring the emergence of a novel coronavirus originating in Wuhan, China. Due to the enlarging geographic area affected and evidence of person-to-person transmission, it is likely that people will require assessment in Wales and the wider UK. So we've just been discussing your awareness. Would it be fair to say that the 24th of January 2020 is the last possible date?
Well, at this time, the response to the coronavirus as it was during January was being dealt with by the health department. It wasn't necessarily an event that was being dealt with collectively by the government, so far as I could see. And I don't remember this particular statement being issued, but at that stage, there's no reason why that would have necessarily been shared with me in the civil contingencies structures.
Returning then, if we can, to the civil contingencies group that we've just discussed, you confirm that you convened and chaired a meeting of that group on the morning of the 4th of February 2020. And you say this provided the first opportunity for an informed discussion to take place at senior official level about the official information that was then available and the potential risks of COVID-19 as they might materialise for the Welsh Government. So what do you say triggered that meeting?
I would say my natural pessimism. In a sense, working in the civil contingencies area, one of our doctrines is to prepare. It seemed to me at the end of January we were in the position where there was a potential for coronavirus to come to the UK and therefore to come to Wales. And my intention of convening that first civil contingencies group was to find out more about it for myself, to find out exactly what we knew as a government at that stage, but more importantly, to engage a wide range of policy colleagues from across the government. So that would be from the education, the social care department, a number of other departments as well, so that we could all understand the, if you like, the common recognised information picture at that point, and to begin to consider what, if anything, we needed to do, and when we might need to do it. And I'm fairly sure that at that stage I was saying to that group of colleagues, you need to begin to go and talk to your sectors, to talk to education and to talk to business potentially about the potential for a pandemic, and then to begin at that stage draft thinking around preparedness.
Just one final question before we take a break. You mentioned in respect of the statement of Vaughan Gething that you don't remember that being brought to your attention. Had that been brought to your attention with what you've described as your natural pessimism, do you think you might have convened a meeting of the Civil Contingencies Group earlier than the 4th of February?
I'm sure I would.
Thank you, my lady. Would that be a convenient moment?
Certainly, I shall return at 3:50.
All rise. Thank you. Can we please have on screen the minutes of the 4th of February Civil Contingencies Group meeting, INQ 30321239. And as discussed, you chaired this meeting, is that correct?
Correct.
If we can look at page 1, paragraph 1.2, the ECCW will be formally established today. Can you briefly explain, please, the role and function of the ECCW in a public health emergency such as this?
Technically speaking, the ECCW is a room rather than a group. I'm sorry. But essentially what it does is to bring together the resilience team with Category 1 partners as defined under the Civil Contingencies Act to enable two things really. First of all, to begin to plan and understand what each of the partners, each of the responders are doing in order to understand the issue, the contingency issue they're dealing with. And secondly, to begin developing a common recognised information picture, i.e. what is the sum of all of the knowledge of those responders in order that we can begin to coordinate and potentially communicate the actions that need to be taken across those partners. And for us as a government, and particularly the resilience team, we can begin to tell ministers that there is action underway.
So this is from the 4th of February 2020. Can we briefly please turn to INQ 303212228? And this is a meeting of the Civil Contingencies Group on the 18th of February. And if we can look on page 3. And in the middle, we can see it says Gary Haggerty explained that at present, ECCW is not formally stood up, but they are considering the need to formally stand up in the near future. And then if we can go to the Cabinet minutes, please, from the 25th of February 2020, 30129852. And at paragraph 5.4, page 6, it says the Emergency Coordination Centre Wales was ready to stand up if and when required. So my question is, can you help us with when the ECCW was formally established?
The ECCW began operating in the way I described from the 4th of February, and that was in line with the weekly civil contingencies groups that we had put in place. There is a threshold in the Pan Wales response plan at which, when we say the ECCW is stood up, that is more about the physical location of partners and a move from normal working hours to extended working hours because the amount of the number of issues that we need to deal with, or the severity of the situation, demands a greater input from the resilience team and those partners. And so I think by the time we got to the 25th of February, we were considering, sorry, I'm trying to remember the date, moving the ECCW onto extended working hours, and then certainly during March we moved them from, I think it's 7 in the morning to 8 at night, from 7 in the morning to 10 o'clock at night. And so it was a gradual mobilisation.
I'm sorry, I didn't really understand that answer. Could you help me again?
Okay.
Ms. Pacey's question was, when was the ECCW formally established?
I would say the 10th of February, we wrote out to local resilience forum to explain that the ECCW was running at that point. I can't remember the exact phrase that we used in the letter, but the team were operating from the 4th, and as we moved through February, we were extending their working hours because the scale of the task grew.
I don't know if you want to pursue it, Ms. Page. I still don't think I can quite follow, but anyway.
Thank you, my lady.
Maybe I'm not following who's on the ECCW.
That would be the resilience team in
Yeah.
my directorate. That would also be the category 1 responders under the civil
So the local
contingencies.
authorities and the like.
So there would be local authorities, health boards,
Police
the
officers.
police and fire service, ambulance, and the military.
So was it meeting? You talk about your team and extended hours. Was the ECCW meeting?
It was not physically co-located at that point.
Sorry, was it meeting?
The ECCW is
Well, it's like COBRA, isn't it? We use it for meetings, but it's actually a room.
it is a room. It is a physical location at which partners would gather together. So to the extent that I can explain it without relation to a physical room, the partners were engaging on a daily basis from the 4th, from the original date through February.
Were they engaging in a meeting or by...
They were engaging in a meeting, and they were engaging through providing information into the system.
Right. Thank you.
Can we perhaps stay on the topic of the ECCW, please? And skipping ahead slightly, you wrote to local resilience forums on the 10th of March, and that letter is INQ 30321241, stating that from the next day, so that would be the 11th of March, that the ECCW would operate from 7 a.m. till 7 p.m. Monday to Friday. And then this was increased to 7 days a week from 8 a.m. till 10 p.m. from the 20th of March, and that was confirmed in a letter from the First Minister. Is that right?
Correct.
Do you think those escalations happened quickly enough?
At the time, I think they were reasonable escalations based on the information that we had. I'm not sure that had we brought those escalations forward, it would have made a material difference to our response.
It's right that in your statement you confirm, as Wales emerged from the first wave of COVID, that the Joint Emergency Services Group, Welsh Government and the Strategic Coordinating Groups would undertake a lessons learned exercise. And that was to understand how the emergency services and preparedness structures had responded to the pandemic. And that was the Pan Wales Covid-19 Lessons Management Project Board,
Indeed.
which you chaired, and you confirm it met 5 times, and a lessons identified register was compiled to track the progress. If we can please have on screen INQ 30187578, and we can see that this document was last updated on the 3rd of March 2023. Is that correct? And on page 19, we can see under recommendations, review the triggers for establishment of ECCW and the response structures for health emergencies. And under paragraph 6.5, prompt establishment of a full ECCW functionality should follow once a public health emergency is declared. We can then see at the bottom a comment, a formal review of the Pan Wales response plan will be undertaken and a task and finish group will be established to take this forward. Has there been a review about the trigger to establish the ECCW undertaken to date?
The quote here, the work that is outlined here is being taken forward through our review of civil contingencies processes in Wales. I can't confirm that there is a specific piece of work on the triggers for standing up the ECCW. I agree that it is a very important point of transition for us. And on reflection, I can see that at the beginning, in those early days of COVID, we should have been clearer about the status of the ECCW and when we were moving through those phases towards full mobilisation.
Can we then please return our minds back to the Civil Contingencies Group meeting on the 4th of February, and we don't need to have the minutes back up again, but the minutes note that there would be an internal meeting on the 10th of February to discuss the Welsh Government's pandemic plan. Is that a meeting you remember taking place?
I don't recall that meeting.
Your statement talks about the Health Emergency Planning Unit, or HEPU. Can you please briefly explain the role that HEPU played in the Welsh Government's pandemic response?
My understanding of the Health Emergency Planning Unit is that it provided if you like, an equivalent to the resilience team's function for the NHS. So it dealt with civil contingencies planning. It dealt with how to operationalise some of those the actions required by that planning, issuing guidance and determining policy for the NHS and the health service. I didn't have any detailed engagement with the operation of HEPU in the run-up to the 23rd of March.
Can we please look at INQ 303207119, which is an email, if we can look at the email please from David Golding. If we start with page 3, this email chain begins with an email from the UK Cabinet Office attaching SAGE planning assumptions and the draft communications plan on the 13th of February. If we can then please look above that, and we have the email from David Golding, and we can see your name appears along with some others. And it says, please note the planning assumptions coming out from SAGE. I don't propose any wider sharing of this, as it states not to be shared beyond HMG and SAGE members. I assume it will go to COBRA ministers to consider, can then be shared wider. The assumptions reflect a pandemic, but the one surprise is the clinical attack rate. If I'm reading this correctly, it suggests 80%, whereas for a pandemic, it's 50%. And if we can keep that in mind, but now turn to the attached SAGE planning assumptions, INQ 303207118, and we can see first row, incubation period estimated 1 to 14 days, significantly longer than pan-flu reasonable worst case. Third row, basic reproductive rate is estimated to be 2 to 3 in Wuhan. Fourth row, the doubling rate in China, just 4 to 5 days. Seventh row, transmission. Asymptomatic transmission could not be ruled out, and transmission from mildly symptomatic individuals is likely. Then on page 2, please, first row, we can see 80% of the population could possibly be infected, which is the point picked up by David Golding in the email that he sent. And then the fourth row, 4% of the population could require hospitalisation. It would be fair to say that these were worrying assumptions, is that right?
That's absolutely correct.
Would you agree that looking at these assumptions, it was plain that this was going to be a whole systems emergency by this stage at the latest?
It was clear to me that it was going to be an emergency that would go well beyond the civil contingencies responses that we had been planning for and exercising for in the past, and indeed beyond those consideration that we'd given the pandemic flu plans some years, the plans that were published some years before.
And so did you have a pause for thought at this point and consider we're not sufficiently prepared to deal with this?
My response to David's email was to raise the significance of the planning assumptions and what I could see as a developed communication plan within the UK government, which was attached to this email as well, with a range of senior colleagues.
If we could come on to your response in just a moment, but in terms of your personal thoughts, did you think we're not prepared for this?
I don't think that crossed my mind at the time. My focus was much more on how do we respond, what can I do personally and professionally to mobilise the organisation so that we can build a response, recognising these new and more serious planning assumptions. If
we can then go on to your response to David Golding, please, and back to 30320 please. And if we can go to the first page. And your email says this material needs to be shared internally and rapidly. And so would it be right to say that you were surprised that David Golding had said, don't share it more widely?
I was surprised that the information wasn't being shared more widely, given its nature and the implications for departments across the government.
And so your response was to escalate this as quickly as you could to the Director Generals and to the Permanent Secretary?
It was.
As far as you're aware, do you know if these planning assumptions were cascaded higher up to ministers and cabinet?
I don't know. I was really focused on the operational response at this stage and trying to mobilise a wider group of colleagues across the organisation. I would have assumed that the discussion around the planning assumptions themselves would have been conducted through the health department.
So would it be fair to say you didn't directly discuss this with a minister?
I did not.
Is that a regret?
This was very clearly a public health issue, certainly at this stage. And in my professional view at the time was the experts and ministers needed to be discussing these matters, and also the more widely within the health and social care group. On this particular day, my concern was to escalate to senior colleagues so that we could begin considering how we would respond as a government.
So it would be fair you were operating on the basis that this would be passed on and you would focus on the operational response. Does it then surprise you or shock you that Cabinet didn't in fact discuss COVID until the 25th of February?
I think I don't know what discussions were had within the health department and with the health minister, and the content of cabinet agendas and the judgments of ministers about what was discussed was something that would have been a matter for them rather than me.
Can I please move on? We can take that down. You attended some meetings with Mark Sweeney, and you describe this in your statement in February and early March. Mm-hmm. And you explain these meetings were with your counterparts in the UK government and the other devolved administrations. They were referred to as ESSIG, which means Essential Service, Society and Infrastructure Group. Is that right?
That's correct.
You outlined that the purpose of these meetings was to collate information and evidence on likely impact of MPIs to inform papers to be presented to ministers. Is that fair?
That's correct.
Now, at this point, Mark Sweeney was Director General of the Cabinet Secretary in the Cabinet Office. Are you able to give an idea of how much contact you had with him in late February, early March?
Probably 3 meetings. I was an attendee along with a number of other colleagues from devolved administrations and the UK government at, as I say, probably 3 meetings.
The inquiry heard evidence from Helen McNamara in Module 2. If we could please have the transcript, 000000039. And I'm not going to read all of this out, but if we can just look at the following. The account that Mr. Cummings has given is of you walking from the Cabinet Office into Downing Street and, in fact, into the Prime Minister's study that evening. He wasn't there, the Prime Minister, but you saying, and this is his account, but I think you agree with it, that you had just been talking to Mark Sweeney, whose name we've just seen, who was in charge of coordinating with the Department of Health. He said, that's Mr. Sweeney has said, but you're reporting it. I have been told for years there's a whole plan for this. There is no plan. We are in huge trouble. Now, to summarise then, this was a conversation put to Helen McNamara from the 13th of March 2020, and the upshot is that Mr. Sweeney was saying on that date, I have been told for years there's a whole plan for this. There is no plan. We're in huge trouble. And my question is whether that's something that Mark Sweeney ever said to you in those meetings.
No.
Did anyone from the UK government say words like that to you?
No. The ESIG meetings that I attended were very task-focused, very constructive, and intended solely on looking at the implications around, I think it's 6 potential non-pharmaceutical interventions. And when I say implications, I mean, what were the sort of social implications? What would these measures mean if they were for the economy, if they were put in place? So, no, the meetings were very positive and forward-looking.
Do you think if that had been said to you, you would have done anything differently?
I would certainly have been very surprised to have heard anything like this reported in such a cross-government forum. I think as a government, and my professional colleagues within Welsh Government, I think we would have probably acted quite differently over the following few weeks if we had understood that there was a lack of a plan, and I don't know from this quote whether it's a lack of a cross-government plan or a lack of a plan in Department of Health, but in any case, I think some of our thinking may have been accelerated had we known of this exchange.
Can I please move on to a different topic, which is ministerial implementation groups? And it's right that you attended almost all of the general public sector implementation meetings. Can we please have on screen paragraph 167 of your witness statement from a personal capacity, INQ 302745156? And here you talk about the MIGs operating. And you say it was common for us to be provided with the papers during the morning of the meeting itself, which normally started around 1 p.m. On occasion, the papers would be circulated as late as an hour or two in advance. That made commissioning, compiling and submitting briefings to Welsh ministers, often on complex and wide-ranging subjects, very challenging. And then I don't propose to read the rest of this quote, but that gives us a general flavour of your views on the ministerial implementation groups. How could those meetings have been improved?
I can think of 2 immediate ways that those meetings could have been improved. First of all, a more collaborative approach to identifying the subjects that we really wanted to talk about as 4 nations, rather than those which may have a greater focus on England. Secondly, as a consequence of that, potentially drawing up shared agendas, working together on how we would frame particular issues, and then, I suppose, thirdly, how we would go about putting papers together that would properly reflect the views of the devolved administrations.
Can we then please talk about the 21-day reviews, please? If we can start with the first of the 21-day reviews, and it's right that the coronavirus regulations stipulated that they had to be reviewed every 3 weeks. The first review on the 16th of April 2020, you say that you brought together the team which undertook the first review. Is that correct?
Correct.
The inquiry has a statement from Thomas Smithson, who was heavily involved in the 21-day review process. We don't need to go to his statement, but it's at INQ 30282461. He says, the first substantive piece of work I was asked to undertake was the first review of the health protection regulations. I did not have any team. This became my principal task, drawing on others' views and evidence. There was no framework or process established, with my approach guided by legal advice on the obligations in the regulations and public health and scientific advice on the progression of the pandemic. So would it be fair to say, as he says in his words, he undertook that review by himself?
He also undertook that review under the supervision of Deborah Carter, who was one of my deputy directors, who I asked to move across and help establish the 21-day reviews, and she was present and overseeing the first 3. I also brought together a group of colleagues from across the Welsh Government who would help to provide information and to steer Thomas in the work that he was doing, and also to provide the necessary input of evidence particularly, but also to help shape and quality assure the process.
Do you have a comment as to why he included in his statement deliberately, I did not have any team?
I don't think Thomas had a team underneath him to help do the work, but there was a group of people around him to help, as I say, shape the review. Those colleagues probably didn't write it in the way that Thomas did, but there was certainly a number of people who were supporting and advising him as we went through that first review.
In respect of his comments that there was no framework or process established for the first review, is that something you'd agree with?
That's absolutely correct. We only realised that we would have to review the regulations every 21 days around the 23rd of March when they were originally brought forward. So this was an area that we hadn't anticipated. It hadn't featured as in any of the previous pandemic flu planning that we had done for the decade before. So it was essentially a very new and very demanding burden that was placed on us.
So is your evidence that you realised on the 23rd of March that there would need to be a review in 21 days?
Yes.
And so why were those 21 days not used to create a framework or a process?
They were. They were used. Tom basically created that framework as we prepared the first set of reviews, and that framework provided the basis for the second and the third and the subsequent reviews. And at the same time, we spent every review reflecting on the last one to see where we could improve. And so by the time we got to the summer, I think it's certainly my view, and I would hope colleagues would agree, that we had developed a very clear process with some excellent legal input, which made sure that the decisions we were asking ministers to take would be well-founded, fed by a large number of pieces of evidence that would be renewed and refreshed and put forward as part of that process.
Moving on then to engagement with local authorities, please. And you may be aware the inquiry heard evidence this afternoon from Dr. Llewellyn. And at paragraph 51 of your statement on behalf of the Local Government Directorate, you talk about regular and open engagement with local government was a central principle of the Welsh Government COVID-19 response. Can we please have Dr. Llewellyn's second statement on the screen, please, at paragraphs 12 and 13? And here he says, For instance, the WLGA notes the statement of Reg Kilpatrick, who had been Director General Covid-19 Crisis Coordination for the Welsh Government, and how he observes that there was regular communication with local government and that there being strong pre-existing relationships with local authorities, both collectively and individually, at the outset of the pandemic. Communication is not, however, the same as consultation, and still less is it co-production. The WLGA considers that in several ways, Mr Kilpatrick's views about the extent of communication fail to recognise the extent to which there was inadequate early engagement with local government, engagement which could have ensured that the operational issues which local government would encounter were properly taken into account and which, had they been, could have much improved outcomes. What is your response to that?
I think the distinction between communication and consultation in the circumstances of the early days of COVID is a very thin distinction. So in practice, every engagement that I, my team and ministers had with the WLGA, whether that was at leader level or at official level, were in effect consultations. They weren't traditional civil service consultations where, as we know, we'd send out a paper and expect people to respond. They were very open, often very challenging meetings where we would be putting forward briefings, first of all. We would then be explaining our plans or our intentions for, within the 21-day review, what we were going to do next. And we would be having that real-time consultation at political level and official level on a very regular basis, 2-3 times a week in some cases. Equally about early engagement, I've engaged local authorities through my EU Transition Board on the 4th of February, which was 3 days after we had, after the World Health Organization had declared COVID a global emergency and before it declared a pandemic. So we begun consultation with some chief executives representing their regions through that forum. We were also, certainly from the 10th of February, in very regular engagement with all of the local authorities through the local resilience fora in terms of helping them to understand the reasonable worst case scenarios and the planning that they and their organisations needed to do, both to respond and as organisations themselves. So I would dispute the fact that we didn't consult. I think we had an extraordinary level of consultation. I think in February and March, we had in excess of 30 meetings each month between the Welsh Government officials and ministers and local government. That was just my area. If we look at subject-specific issues, so housing or social care, there were other engagements that were going on, again, on a very regular basis, once or twice a week throughout COVID, to make sure that we understood the pressures on local government, that we understood their views, and those views would be quite significantly different across the 22, and that those views were reflected in our advice to ministers or indeed reflected by ministers around the cabinet table.
Can I please just read into the record the INQ of that witness statement is INQ 000410950. In respect of early engagement, which you have just briefly touched upon, in your statement on behalf of the local government directorate, you do accept that engagement wasn't always early enough. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair, and that engagement was it could have been better. It most certainly would have been better had we had more information to share from the UK government. We were quite constrained in what we could say because the flow from the UK government was at times limited, and particularly in the run-up to the first lockdown.
Can we please have on screen minutes of a meeting of the Welsh Government officials and WLG representatives on the 12th of March, which we have at INQ 30321
Just before you go on to that, can I just go back to your answer? You were constrained by limitations on the flow of information from the UK government. As I understood it, the chief medical officers were meeting regularly. People from the devolved nations by this stage were attending SAGE, or albeit maybe they should have been involved a bit earlier. I'm not following why you say there was a limitation on the flow of information, and that's what constrained you. Why you're basically passing the buck for the criticism to the UK government?
I'm not passing the buck in the sense that I think some of the WLGA's concerns were in the run-up to lockdown and the surprise with which that decision took them. And I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is that had we known more about the move of the Prime Minister to lockdown on that Monday evening, we would have been able to share more information with them so that they could plan and prepare their organisations better. As it was, we didn't have that information. As a government, we were unsighted on that. Although we did meet the local government leaders in the week before that lockdown decision was taken to brief them and to discuss with them the information that we did have. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be passing the buck to the UK government.
I probably shouldn't have used that expression.
It was more a case of that was a particular decision that I know colleagues had concern about, and that was a concern that we also had, but we were unable to move ahead because we didn't have the information.
So basically, when you said constrained by the limitations on the flow of information, you were specifically had in mind the lockdown.
It was that decision particularly.
Thank you.
Yes.
Staying on the topic of engagement with local authorities, these are minutes of a meeting on the 12th of March. And if we can have on page 2, please. And it says update from Reg Kilpatrick. And we can see in the second paragraph, it's noted, how do we work with you to avoid series of meetings? And then page 3, we can see it says, need to work out how we best channel guidance and info to get to the right people as quickly as we can. How do we work with you so we don't create a whole series of meeting and share? That reads, would you agree, like a reluctance to have those meetings with local government?
No, I don't interpret that as a reluctance. What I interpret that to mean, to me, and particularly at the time, how we work out the very best channels to engage and consult with the right colleagues in local government. We were under, as were our local authority chief executives and their teams, under enormous time pressure to turn guidance around, to develop new policy, and in some ways our traditional, rather hierarchical approach to consultation would simply not have worked. And so this quote for me is, how do we work out a different way of engaging? And I think we actually did that quite successfully.
Going to change topic completely then, please, and ask about the Joint Biosecurity Centre. And you were closely involved in the early stages of the establishment of the JBC. And indeed, you sat on the steering board that was set up to provide executive leadership to the organisation. You, in fact, cleared a ministerial advice relating to the JBC on the 2nd of June 2020. We don't need that brought up, but it's INQ 303208880. You explain in the ministerial advice that the purpose of the Joint Biosecurity Centre is to detect, understand and rapidly act upon local, regional and national outbreaks of Covid-19 infection through targeted non-pharmaceutical interventions. We then have the primary functions of the JBC, and then we can see it says, while there are still a number of issues to work through with respect to the detailed design and operation of the JBC, In light of the progress made to date in amending the operating model to better reflect Welsh interests, it is recommended that you provide an in-principle agreement for Welsh participation in the JBC. And it's right that the First Minister accepted the recommendation.
Correct.
You go on to say in your witness statement at paragraph 175, during an extraordinary time, it is my view that the development of the JBC was an exemplar of effective joint working on a complex matter by the four nations, achieved with a proactive attitude, commitment and a desire to succeed. Can you explain what leads you to say that?
Our normal experience with working with a number of other Whitehall departments is that sometimes it can be quite difficult to really work in collaboration. The JBC, as an offer to us as a Welsh government, I thought was particularly exciting. I thought that the individuals involved were highly committed to delivering that task. Sorry, would you repeat the question?
Why was it so good?
Why was it so good? Well, I'm answering this question in two ways, really. The concept was great. The individuals were also, I think, really committed. We did not make, we did not achieve the full potential of the JBC. And I don't mention that in my statement, but I think on reflection, we had great opportunity. However, for a number of reasons, it was not possible to create that sort of four-nation organisation that would feed back into our own deliberations and our own creation of evidence, and actually to our own 21-day review.
So it was a good idea, but it didn't quite manifest itself in that way.
It was a great idea that was, I think, just not completely delivered on the ground.
We have a statement from Craigus Solomons. We don't need to go to it. It's INQ 30291490. And I want to just briefly summarise some criticisms made and ask if you agree with them. The first, paragraph 49, commissioning of projects came directly from policy leads who had little understanding of devolution. Would you agree with that?
I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there, because the commissioning of projects, we would have the opportunity to commission projects into the JBC. I presume he's referring to the fact that projects would be commissioned that would look at England only. If that is the case, I can understand why that would be. I think there were some issues about securing access to data from Wales.
Another criticism he has, perhaps following on from that, paragraph 50, there was a clear divide in the JBC between teams who are supporting the devolved administrations and those who are supporting UK government. As such, if the work was carried out for UK government, typically UK government ministers were asked for approvals before sharing with the devolved administrations, which meant very little evidence was developed that could be used to inform policy making in Wales. Is that a fair criticism?
That is not my understanding of how the JBC worked from either my own experience or from a colleague, Joe Trott, who was embedded into the JBC specifically to underline our commitment to it as an organisation, but also provide us with a really clear understanding of what the JBC was doing and how it was going about it. So I'm sorry, I don't recognise that criticism.
It's right that the Joint Biosecurity Centre was integrated into the UK Health Security Agency in October 2021. In your view, did that change the focus at all?
Yes, I think it did, actually. And I think some of the independence of thought and the independence of action that we enjoyed previously sort of dissipated. And so the relevance of the JBC to us as a government dissipated alongside that.
Moving on then to a few questions about local restrictions, please. On the 3rd of September 2020, you received a call from the Chief Executive of Caerphilly County Borough Council, who wanted to discuss her concerns about the rising number of infections in the area and wanted to discuss with you what measures could be taken to try and bring those under control. Is that right?
That's right.
You then emailed Dr. Atherton, Dr. Orford and Simon Brindle, and we can see your email, please, on screen. 4th of September 2020, INQ 303209119. And we can see the first paragraph. She was unsure about how to engage Welsh Government or where she should get advice from regarding which MPIs would be effective and appropriate in the circumstances and her ability to act locally. I looked back at the CV control plan for Wales, which is not specific about the escalation from local or regional to national and does not describe how this should happen. For example, it is not clear how the local or regional interests or concerns get fed directly into HPAG considerations. So at this stage, was there a lack of clarity as to how local authorities should approach and respond to local outbreaks?
Well, clearly, my colleague, Chief Executive in Caerphilly, was not aware of the escalation process. The ICT and the OCT and the IMT, incident management team and outbreak control team that were operating in the region, at that stage, from an earlier email, were saying this was not a matter of concern, and so I think what this email demonstrated to me is that there was a structure in place, but nonetheless the chief executive and I think the leader of the authority were becoming very worried about what they perceived, or what they saw as a growing number of cases within the authority.
So is it your evidence that there was a plan in place that people understood?
I think looking at the coronavirus control plan, there was an annex which we added to that document, which would point the outbreak control teams towards the strategic coordinating group in the first instance.
So then it could have been clearer?
It could have been clearer.
And we know that there had been local restrictions, in fact, in England in the summer of 2020. And you say in your witness statement about this fact, it was not unusual for incidents in Wales to be 2 to 3 weeks behind that in the south of England. And therefore, we were confident that we would experience similar growth in due course and were planning on that basis. So would you agree work should have been done on these plans earlier than when they actually needed to be put into action?
I think we should have been clearer during the summer, given that we were beginning to consider the chances of a second wave, and we should have been clearer with colleagues across certainly the civil contingencies planning structures about what would happen and what should happen and what plans were available.
It's right, isn't it, that ultimately it was agreed Caerphilly would compile in conjunction with Public Health Wales a list of additional measures that it wanted to implement. Then these proposed measures would be further discussed within Welsh Government before advice went to ministers. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you think that that was the right way round, namely that the onus was on the local authority to come up with a plan of action rather than the Welsh Government?
That was in line with the Public Health Wales Communicable Disease Outbreak Control Plan. So we were following Public Health Wales guidance at that point.
It's right that ultimately a HPAG subgroup was created, which you chaired.
Correct.
What was the purpose of this subgroup, and was that something you found helpful?
The reason why, and if I may call it HPAG OSG for brevity, was created was in recognition of the speed at which the issues in Caerphilly emerged, the cadence of meetings that were in place over the summer, I think, were weekly, and clearly, as we were moving into a period of significant growth in the virus, we would need also to adjust our plans so that we could act quickly. So HPAG OSG was put in place 2 days after the Caerphilly measures were put in place. And the group met daily for quite some time after that, simply because we needed all of the experts in a room looking at incidents, looking at pressures, and being ready to provide advice to ministers within hours if necessary.
If we can then go further along the timeline into September, please, and moving on towards the fire break. We don't need to bring this up on screen, but on the 18th of September 2020, there was advice from TAC, which advised that a package of non-pharmaceutical interventions on local and national scale may be needed to bring R back below 1. Do you recall being aware of that advice on the 18th of September?
I have seen the advice and I've read it, but I couldn't confirm that I read it at, yes, I would have been aware of it at the time because it would have formed part of the 21-day review material.
Generally speaking, then, you would have read TAC advice as part of that review process?
Yes.
Again, I don't need it to be brought up on screen, but on the 21st of September 2020, SAGE was advising that a circuit breaker should be considered to return incidents to low levels. Is that something you think you would have been aware of at the time?
It's very unlikely that I would have seen SAGE advice. I relied on TAG and TAC to provide us with the necessary information for the 21-day review.
If we return then back to TAC advice, there was further advice on the 25th of September, 2nd of October and 9th of October. And if we can please have on screen the 9th of October advice, which is INQ 4066397. And if we can have page 2, please. And we can see the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies estimate of the reproduction number has fallen since last week, but there is still exponential growth of COVID-19 cases in Wales, as rate is still above 1. Second bullet point, this may lead to hospital admissions rising across Wales unless further control measures are applied. Fifth bullet point, for the first time in this wave of infections, the incidence for Wales is higher than 100 cases per 100,000 people. Total test positivity for Wales is 7.8%. All local authorities have seen more than 25 cases per 100,000 over the past week and have above 2.5% test positivity. Now, looking at this timeline, would you agree that as early as 18th of September 2020, in the first TAC advice that we looked at, there had been calls to start considering a circuit breaker lockdown?
There were certainly discussions about a circuit breaker lockdown, indeed.
And it's right that on the 12th of October 2020, you attended a COBRA meeting at which the First Minister, Mark Drakeford, asked whether a circuit breaker or fire break lockdown would be considered, as had been advised by SAGE. Mm-hmm. Do we take it then from the First Minister's question that Wales was waiting for the UK to make the first move in respect of a circuit breaker?
No, I don't think that's a fair inference. The First Minister and Cabinet were looking at the evidence and information as it related to Wales, and as we saw, would have been prepared and were prepared to take their own action if necessary.
It's right that the fire break implementation group was established, and that was by yourself. That was the 14th of October, and as we've just discussed, there had been advice from as early as the 18th of September to start considering this. Do you think that that group should have been established earlier to at least start considering it?
There were discussions ongoing between TAC and the CMO and others, including me, about the potential for a fire break for a couple of weeks before that date. So it just because there wasn't a group established to consider formally, and I think that the fire break implementation group was much more about implementation and options, the growing need or the growing understanding of the pressures for a fire break had been in discussion for a couple of weeks before that.
Can you help us with this? Are you aware that the Swansea modelling team was only asked to model a fire break on the 11th of October 2020?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
It's right, the fire break implementation group met a number of times. No minutes were taken of those meetings. Given the significance of the work of that group, is that something that should have been formally recorded?
Quite possibly we should have taken a minute, but the product of that group were a series of papers that were compiled by Tom Smithson particularly, but contributed to by others, and were submitted to Cabinet and to Ministers for discussion. So to the extent that there was a record of the work of the group, that was summarised in those papers.
Having discussed the timeline, would you accept that there was a delay in implementing a circuit breaker?
We began our work on the 13th of October. If memory serves me right, the first discussion by ministers was on the 18th. I may not have that date completely right, but there were three cabinet discussions on the basis of the work of my group, which culminated in a final decision about a fire break, which was then implemented on the 23rd. Given the amount of information that we needed to deal with, given the development of the policy, given the legal issues that needed to be considered, I think we moved as quickly as we possibly could from the initial commission by the First Minister to the production of options for Cabinet and then the final decision. It was certainly our very highest priority organisationally at the time.
In respect of the initial commission by the First Minister for your group, would it be your opinion that that commission should have come earlier?
Regardless of the commission, maybe we should have been doing a more structured thinking in advance of that commission. However, as I say, I think we saw the COBRA meeting as a bit of a turning point. And some of the views expressed by the Chief Medical Officer in England about events certainly in the southeast of England.
Final topic then, please, which is the topic of shielding. So we're circling back.
Okay.
And if we can have on screen INQ 000197994, which is an email chain starting at the bottom, 18th of March 2020, from an individual at the Cabinet Office, sent to you and to others. I am copying Simon Ridley, Cabinet Office DG, newly responsible for coordination on health and social care during the pandemic. He needs to speak to you as early as possible today about shielding of vulnerable people. I'm emailing to make the contacts and know Simon would be keen to arrange a conference call. If we can then look at page 3, please, and you send an email which says, if it's at the top, this is 2020 on the same day, stating, thanks, Simon. It'd be very helpful to see some papers or plans or the slide pack material sent to LAs in England first thing tomorrow to help the discussion at COBRA. Did I miss a conference call earlier? So this would seem to suggest that on the 18th of March 2020, so 5 days before lockdown, there were no real plans in place for shielding. Would you agree?
There weren't in Wales, and this was the initiation of the conversations with the UK government about its plans for its shielding programme.
So is it your evidence that it was the UK government that hadn't prepared for shielding?
I think my evidence would be that none of us had really given that detailed discussion for the impacts of social isolation measures on our most vulnerable.
And do you think that that is something that Wales could and should have been doing by this point?
I can say we should have been doing it. We should have been doing many things with the benefit of hindsight. At the time, we were very focused on a whole range of issues about moving into a lockdown potentially, and then once after the 23rd of March, managing that lockdown. So I'm not sure that it is fair to say we could have done anything at that point. I would also say that this is a very good example of sometimes that sharing of information between the Welsh Government and the UK Government being quite late and often quite restricted.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kilpatrick. That's all the questions that I have for you. My lady, there are some granted Rule 10s, and I believe there may be a live application.
No, I think that's disappeared. Thank you.
Very
Ms.
grateful.
Heaven.
Good afternoon, Mr. Kilpatrick. I represent the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice Cymru. First topic I want to ask you about is data, please. So it's about the adequacy of data that was being pulled together for the 21-day review process. Now, you deal with this at paragraph 121 of your witness statement, but don't worry, I will indicate to you what's in that, so we don't need to bring that up. Of course, you explain there that you're pulling together data, or your team are pulling together data for the 21-day review process in order to inform advice to ministers. You give some examples of the sorts of data that was being pulled together, TAC and TAG data. You're also looking at stats about pressure on the NHS. You're looking at confirmed cases of COVID-19, and you say all of this was being scrutinised daily by ministers. Now, Andrew Nelson, who is the Chief Information Officer at Cwmtaf Morgannwg University Health Board, is highly critical in his witness statement to the inquiry of the inability to extract data from NHS systems in Wales. And he says, certainly in the early part of wave 1, this resulted in large swathes of information not being readily available to the NHS in Wales. There was limited access to prevalence and admission data from which we could monitor or estimate growth rates to provide an effective operational response. And crucially, he says, there was no differentiation between community and hospital-acquired infection. And I think it's fair to say he limits that to sort of the March time. So my question is this: did you know about these concerns with extracting data and the adequacy of data at the time? And if so, were ministers also aware?
No, I didn't know about those issues or the issues that Andrew raises. I wouldn't have expected to know. I didn't work in the health department, and my responsibilities didn't extend to the sort of health informatics or the NHS data or data collection. In putting together the 21-day reviews, we would rely on TAG and TAC as our principal source of epidemiological and public health information.
But if ministers are not being given necessarily the best data, isn't that something that they need to know to make their decisions?
Well, that would have been a matter for my colleagues in health, who would understand these issues much more clearly and much more directly than I.
Understood. Next topic, please, is a WhatsApp discussion. So what I'm going to do is first ask you to look at a series of WhatsApps. You're not in this group, just so you're aware, but you're mentioned. And just to be clear, I'm not interested in the content of what is said about you. It's what's said about the meeting. So if we could get up, please, it's INQ 3033138, please. This is a WhatsApp chat group called the Coronavirus Legal Hotline, containing Welsh Government officials, lots of special advisors, legal officials, and it talks a lot about guidance. So if we can start, please, it's the 21st of May 2020, and it is Helen Little at 10:54. It's very difficult to see, but we'll try and zoom in. Can you actually see it there in that sizing, or is that a stretch?
Did you say the 20?
If not, I'll read it to you.
Sorry.
So we have Helen Little here. So what we know is there's a WhatsApp chat here going on about a meeting that it would appear that you're involved in. And I'll just read out some of the chat. Helen Little. Who's Helen Little?
Helen Lentle is the Director of Legal Services.
Okay. So she says, Dylan, this is doing in my head. Dylan says, who's Dylan?
Dylan is the head of the Office of Legal.
Yeah, I think is it come off your screen?
It's come off the screen. So
yes.
Finish
Yes.
your answer.
Finish your answer.
Sorry to
Sorry.
interrupt you.
Yeah.
Dylan is the Office of the OLC.
Okay.
He's our counsel, supports our Counsel General.
We now need to make sure we've got the right document.
Yes, I'm not going to read out the,
No, it's just.
because I think some of it's been redacted. Yeah, I know which bits have been redacted.
Are you happy just to read it out?
I'll read it because
Okay.
we've got very little time. So let me just read it. So Dylan says, me too. Helen Lentle says, have left now, meeting with somebody else. And then Dylan picks up again because he's been asked by Jane Runnacles what the meeting's about. He says, guidance, an hour of our lives we're not getting back. We've said this before, but I think we as an organisation are getting less and less focused as time goes on and more people get involved. And then I'll move forward a little bit in the chat. And Jane Runnacles is asking, she appears to be on a different meeting, what's going on? And Dylan says, Reg is ignoring our advice. And Jane Runnacles says, oh God. Helen Lentle said, it's not going well. And then Terry Cowell, who's he?
He works for Dylan, who, can I just say, is the head of the Office of Legislative Counsel.
I see. He said, what is this meeting about again? Jane Runnacles says, and then Helen Lentle said, it's about Reg not wanting to do something that may be different to what he wants. And then I'll just fast forward to the end. There's another comment there. Helen Lentle said, Reg hates us all and doesn't want another discussion. So I just want to understand, I'm going to show you some minutes of the meeting that we think it is, but can you remember that meeting?
I can't, from this, I can't remember
Completely
what that meeting
understandable.
is. No.
So let me ask you the second document then, which we think might be the minutes. It's the INQ 30221-027. So this would appear to be the only minutes that we have of a meeting on this day involving yourself, 21st of May, and it's titled Next Part 3, and it relates to discussions on COVID-19 measures, schools, workplace, general attitude and public. And we can see there's a number of people present there. I'm not going to ask you about what's documented there because there are lots of things documented. But just looking at that title there, What Next Part 3 and those attendees, do you think that probably is reflective of the meeting?
I'm sorry, I couldn't confirm one way or another. I wasn't part of the WhatsApp group and I don't really know what they were talking about. I have seen this note and frankly, it's not a great note of any meeting, so I'm sorry, I can't help you.
Okay, well that's my question. Thank you very much, my lady.
Right, thank you very much indeed. I'm very grateful for your help. I'm not sure whether that's the last demand we're going to make upon you or request, but thank you anyway.
Okay, thank you.
10 o'clock tomorrow?
Yes, my lady.
Thank you all. All rise.